Hello everybody and welcome to the next part of the serial killer Iceberg. As with the previous episodes in this series, this is going to be one tier, in this case tier 6. And every time that I go into these to research, I look at the information and say, well, maybe I can do the rest of it in one video. And then as I get into research, I'm like, there's no way I can do the rest of this in one video. Because for one, research with this stuff takes a while. And also I don't want to skimp on the details because like I've talked in the past, I'd rather just make the series longer rather than be sparse on the information. And for a reason I'll talk about more at the end, I believe there's only going to be one episode left in this series. And then after that, if you all like, I'm considering throwing the entire series together as one video and then just cutting out the intros and outros so it's just one straight listen through. So let me know if you're interested in that. I do want to say before we get started, as you can imagine with these icebergs, the further down we go, the more depraved it gets. And a few of the killers I'm going to be talking about today are particularly terrible. I mean, they're all terrible, but you know, you get it at this point. As always, I'm not going to be overly crude or disrespectful to the victims and the situations that took place. However, I am going to try to give you as much detail as possible on YouTube. So as always, viewer discretion is advised. And there was one more thing I had to do. Something I'm forgetting. And you know who else is very forgetting? That's right, your bank. Because I don't know about you, but I've had a problem, especially as of recently, where it seems like I never know what my bank's doing. Like they've got these daily spending limits that I can't control, and they'll say a payment's coming out on one day when it actually comes out on the next, so then my card gets randomly shut down, and then I don't know when money's going into the account, I don't know where money's staying, and it's just a huge headache. So someone decided to take up the mantle and be better for your banking services than the banks themselves are, and that is today's sponsor, Kurten. Kurten is a banking system that makes the process comedically easy. To sign up for Kurten, all you do is download the app on your phone, put in your address to get your own debit card sent directly to you, and that's it. Really, that's it. From there, you just activate your card, and then you can use it as a banking system from your phone without all the hassle. Kurten allows you to do things like set your own daily spending limits, as well as even do this really cool insight feature that lets you budget across an entire month and see exactly where your money's going. You can see your balance incredibly easy. You can even register to have an online card that you can use if you don't have your physical card with you for whatever reason, as well as transferring funds in and out, and all of this is done through the app on your phone. So I'm happy that Kurten has stepped up to the plate and done what others cannot, which is make banking not a giant Sudoku puzzle headache thing. So thanks to them, you can go to the link in the description at kurten.com/Wendigoon, sign up today and make your banking a whole lot easier. So thank you so much to everyone for watching. Thank you so much to Kurten for sponsoring the video. It means the most. Again, check them out at the link in the description, and we are back to the video. Without further ado, we are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Peter Kurten, also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, was known to have committed at least 9 murders from February to November of 1929. Peter was the oldest of 13 children, who all of which were horrifically abused by their father. Among things you could kind of predict, like beatings and odd punishments to children, his father also did a form of voyeurism in which him and his wife would and then force the children to see. I'm sure that didn't have any effect on his mental well-being growing up. And before he was even grown up to begin with, at the age of 5, Peter attempted to drown one of his friends. So, you know, a good sign of things to come. And at the age of 9, he befriended a dog catcher within his sort of apartment complex that he lived in. However, the dog catcher was also an alcoholic who would pretty much just catch dogs and then torture and kill them. So Peter joined him on that and seemed to enjoy it. His first murders, although they wouldn't be found out till many years later, occurred when he was only 9 years old. One day while out on a raft, Peter pushed his friend, who he knew couldn't swim, into the water, to which another one of Peter's friends tried to jump into the water to save the first kid, and then Peter held the rescuer underwater, therefore drowning both of them. However, at the time it was just believed that these 2 children drowned accidentally, and at the time no suspicion or charges were given to Peter. So by the age of 13, Peter had ramped up the evil, and he would do this by and I'm stressing at this point, viewer discretion, kids, close your ears, don't watch this. He would begin engaging in kith with animals, and then he could only get there by stabbing them. This would inevitably lead to his interest later in life when he realized it also worked if he did the same thing to people. This supposedly quit when he was spotted stabbing the neighbor's pig for reasons previously described. And that same year, he stole all of the boss's money who he was working an apprenticeship under and then ran away. It was around this time that, according to Peter, he had strangled a girl, not to the point of killing her, just to the point of her passing out, and during it got very excited to the point he realized that the murder, or at least the almost murder, was a replacement for the whole stabbing animals thing. He spent the next few years getting arrested for various crimes like arson and fraud and other wholesome activities, and even was drafted into the German military for a while and then deserted, so he went to jail for that too. It was during this time that he would fantasize in prison about what he wanted to do once he got out. That motivated the crimes he would later commit. One night while performing a break-in, he came across a 9-year-old girl alone in her bedroom. While in there, he managed to stab her to death, which again excited him, before he left and then returned to the bar across the street the next day. He did this because he was so happy with the remorse and disgust of the patrons in the bar discussing the murder that had happened the night previous across the street. And if that wasn't depraved enough, Peter would regularly return to that 9-year-old girl's grave after this event because just touching the soil on top of the coffin enthralled him. Moving on from here, all of the killings he committed were a physical motivation. He figured out that the only way that he could really get excited was through murder. And not only murder, the more depraved the better. Aside from various torture methods like slowly sanguinating his victims or enjoying watching them die, he would plan other large-scale things to freak people out. Like, for example, one of his victims who he had killed in a field and then buried there, he had planned to go back 2 days later so that he could drag out the corpse and then crucify it on a tree coming into town, because the idea of people seeing it and being horrified again made him very the opposite of horrified. While the initial killings were done with objects like scissors and knives, later on in his killings they were majority done with a hammer. But what's really wild is the seeming case of divine intervention that got Peter arrested. Okay, so to explain how he got arrested, you've got to go on this little trip with me. So there was a woman coming into Dusseldorf that has no relation to Peter or any of these murders that are happening. Upon arriving in the town, a man offered to escort her home. And while walking home, he suggested they cut through an empty park as a quicker means of getting where she's going. She, starting to feel weird about walking alone through essentially the woods with this random man, protested and he began to grab her. While this was happening, another man sprinted up and did the whole "is this guy bothering you?" to which the original attacker left and she said thank you to this man who saved her. That man who saved her was Peter. So then Peter says, "Oh ma'am, I'll walk you home," and then on the way there begins to assault her. But since they were semi in public, she began to scream, to which Peter began to get freaked out and then ran away. And then after having been attacked twice in one day, the woman then goes home and writes about it in a letter she mails to her friend back where she came from. However, she wrote the address wrong on the letter, which made the post office go, "Well, we might as well check it." So when they open it and read the description of what I just said, they went, "This sounds a lot like the Vampire of Dusseldorf," because at the time the police had this huge manhunt in order to find the killer. So the police go to the woman who wrote the letter. She says that Peter had mentioned where he lived, and sure enough, whenever they go there, they find Peter Kurten's address. So had it not been for the random guy attacking her, and then Peter just so happening to be there, her surviving, getting the letter wrong, and then the fact that Peter told her where he lived, he may have never came to justice, at least not anytime soon. Peter wasn't home whenever the police showed up, so for a brief amount of time he was in hiding, as his wife, who I mentioned earlier, had told him to hide. And then eventually he tells his wife that she should turn him in and collect the reward money, which she does. It was during the trial that followed more of the specifics of the killings came to light, like the ones I mentioned earlier. And despite Peter coming forward clean and saying that he was guilty, his defense tried to argue that he was insane and essentially tried to form the whole narrative that he was a sadist who didn't know any better. However, whenever those 2 drownings that I mentioned in the beginning came to light, that kind of proved that it wasn't always just because he had something wrong in his brain. It was also the fact that he just liked to kill. The reason he got the nickname the Vampire of Dusseldorf is because many of his victims were found drained, and it turns out it was because Peter would in fact drink their blood. He had absolutely zero emotion at his sentencing, and when given the death penalty, didn't seem to care, to which he was sentenced to death by guillotine. In his final words, he asked the executioner about the guillotine if, for a brief moment after his head was chopped off, if he would be able to hear the blood spurting from his own neck, to which he said that would be the pleasure to end all pleasures. I should also mention, while there's 9 confirmed murders, there are about 31 other murders that is believed to have been committed by him. It was just never proven in the 1920s. So Peter was a voraciously evil man up until the end, and I really have nothing more to add. He was called the vampire for a reason. Next person. Donald Henry Gaskins was confirmed to have killed 13 people from 1970 to 1975. Standing at 5'4" and weighing 130 pounds, he was much more commonly known as Pee-wee, which is the name that the press and later stories would refer to him as. It was believed by many at the time that Donald had a split personality disorder, although the validity of that is debated in modern psychiatry. Although at a young age he suffered considerable abuse from his parents, which could contribute to a condition similar to that. And at the age of only 1, he drank a bottle of kerosene that led to him having convulsions until he was about 3 years old. So I'm sure that did something to his mental stability. And also, the whole bottle? Like you would think after the first sip it'd be like, but it just continued to drink it. To give you an idea of how neglected Pee-wee was by his parents, he mostly lived on the street and did these sort of gang crimes with a group of quote-unquote friends, and had never heard his real name Henry until he heard it read by a judge at the age of 13 when he was on trial for an assault of someone. Like, imagine that, never knowing your real name until a judge reads it to you because you may be going to jail. He was sentenced to jail or juvie, correctional schooling, whatever, at the age of 13 and was repeatedly abused by the other males at the facility. During that time, he broke out, got away, found a girl and married her, before turning himself back in to finish the rest of his sentence, to which he finally got out at 18. After this, he had several in and out stints in prison from various theft or assault charges, but he always maintained respect while in prison despite his size. For example, in one stint, on the first day, he simply killed the biggest, scariest guy in the jail, to which everyone else respected him. What wouldn't be known to people until later on is that while he was doing these other charges he was being arrested for, he was also committing several pleasure killings. Or in other words, he would simply go out and, for fun, find a hitchhiker who he would kidnap and then kill and mutilate their body. In some cases, even claiming to have cannibalized his victims. During this time, he claims that he has committed up to 80 murders just for fun. However, that may be boistering a bit because, again, he valued his opinion as a tough guy. And it's believed by many that the 13 confirmed kills that he had were all done as either a personal or a hit. In other words, he would get mad at someone he was semi-related to or knew in real life and then kill them, or he would quite literally be paid to kill someone. The reason for this being, bodies and evidence have never been found, although that is possible on a spree killing this large. But you would think that they would eventually find maybe a couple bodies. So The whole thing that he would just go out and kill for fun isn't exactly corroborated, although he definitely killed a few people and was as brutal to their bodies as he claimed. One of his associates would later tell police that Gaskins would regularly see missing people on the news and then laugh, saying that's someone he killed and that they'll never find the body. But again, no confirmation if that's true or if that's just him trying to sound tough. So once the police caught up to him just through his various crimes that he committed and eventually connecting the dots on the bodies, they had him suspected on about 9 different murders and then went through with trying him on 1. So whenever he was finally convicted of that murder, he was given the death penalty. But because of some weird complication in South Carolina, they overturned it to a life sentence. So as soon as they did, he immediately confessed to the other 8 murders. Because he really lucked out on getting lucky enough that it went from a death sentence to a life sentence. So he figured while he's getting lucky, might as well confess to the other 8 before he can try him on those to make sure he doesn't get the death penalty. So on his account, sounds pretty lucky, right? Until he messed that up. While he was in jail, his cell was located nearby to a man who was in there for committing a double homicide. What had happened is this guy had attempted to rob a gas station and he killed the 2 owners, a husband and wife who owned it, before making his getaway and getting caught. The son of those 2 store owners thought that this guy deserved death and was very upset whenever the state put him in jail. So somehow, the son gets in contact with Henry, knowing of his criminal history, and pays him $2,000 to kill the man that had killed his own parents. So Henry, who had lucked out on getting a life sentence, decided to throw all of that under the bus and just straight up kill somebody. He had originally planned to use poison, which has some form of plausible deniability, but when that didn't work, he moved to C4. What he did is he took this sort of radio walkie-talkie contraption and lined the inside of it with C4, and then gave it to the guy he was supposed to kill and said it's this device that he smuggled in that will allow them to talk between cells. And that all this guy had to do was hold it up to his ear and then plug it into a wall outlet. And as soon as he tried that, it blew up. To which Henry would later say the last thing that guy ever heard was him laughing from a couple cells away as his head exploded. Because of this, the papers began to refer to Henry as the meanest man in America. So for this killing, he got a whole new trial, to which this time he was given the death sentence and it was not overturned. Which, fun fact, was the first time in the state of South Carolina a white man was ever sentenced to death for murdering a black man. It was during this time that Henry had said he had murdered about 110 people. However, as previously mentioned, like 90 of those he just said and there's no evidence found. And among the people he claimed to kill was like a senator's daughter who went missing. So like, I think he was just like trying to show off. And he was executed by electric chair in 1991, to which his final words when asked if he had any were, "I'll let my lawyers do the talk for me. I'm ready to go." And so Pee-wee died by electric chair in South Carolina. I guess you could say the guy had a short circuit. Okay, moving on. Jack Unterweger killed 10 women from 1974 to 1994. And it's everything that he did within those 20 years that makes it so interesting. At the age of 4 years old, Jack began to live with his grandfather, who was a violent man who stole farm animals, because, you know, child abuse is a common thread with these guys. And from a young age was in trouble with the law for the aforementioned stealing farm animals, because often what would happen is if they were stealing, say, a goat from another farmer's property, whenever the police showed up, the grandpa would just run, so Jack would normally catch the heat for it. And as he grew up, Jack went from being sort of touchy with women to full-on assaulting them. And it finally culminated when Jack was 24 years old and he murdered a woman by strangling her to death with her own bra. To which Jack was promptly caught, tried, and convicted, and then thrown in jail with a 15 to life sentence. While in prison, Jack demonstrated a superb sense of writing, and from his cell wrote various plays, poems, and even an autobiography. From this, he managed to develop an insane cult following from people outside of prison. People read his autobiography in which he talked about how sorry he was. People read read his poems and books and thought that he was such a romantic, charismatic guy, and therefore several petitions began to get him released from jail, with many of the petitions saying the government should pardon him and let him out of jail early. And while that never happened, he was eventually given the minimal sentence of 15 years and got out of prison for murder in an incredibly small amount of time. From there, radios were playing audio of his poems and books being read out loud, and even children in European schools were reading his autobiography, as it was sort of boistered as this poster boy for criminal reform. And everyone was pretty much in agreement that the fact he went to jail and then had all these beautiful things to say was proof that people really can change, because apparently people don't think that murderers can be charming. And from there, he showed up on several different interviews and daytime television shows, and eventually got a job as a TV news reporter. And around this time, guess what? He started killing again, which all of his killings followed the exact same modus operandi, where he would attack women, assault them, and then strangle them to death with their own bras. And since he was a TV news reporter, and most of his victims were victims of opportunity in his region, you can see where this is going, Jack would regularly do the reporting on his own killing spree, being the reporter on the ground. So he would stand there and narrate how an investigation was going for a person that he just murdered, which I have no idea how that went over. I don't speak German, so I can't like read and see the original clips, but that had to be like, okay, so he's there on the field talking about these dead women who were murdered, and he'd had to be like, as you can see, the police are here for a woman that is dead and assaulted and also strangled with her own why am I pretending to hold a microphone? As you can see, and she was also strangled with her own bra. It's a good thing we've never seen a killing like that before. Like, was everyone so dumb they didn't put together that the famous TV reporter who murdered a woman with her own bra, reporting on several local killings of murdered women with their own bra, had like any connection? Not only that, but whenever the news wanted to do a brief sort of documentary about crime in the United States, they sent Jack to LA to do it. And while in LA, 2 more women were murdered in the exact same circumstance, and they still didn't. What? Eventually, someone, by the grace of God, managed to put together that the 2 might be connected. And for a brief stint of time, Jack was on the run and would do things like call the police to convince them that he was innocent. Although, you know, that's not exactly what an innocent person does, but I digress. To which he was convicted of a further 9 murders from the one that happened about 20 years ago. And then the night of his conviction, he hanged himself in his own jail cell. And in a lot of these stories, I read what seemingly just dumb people surrounding a case, whether it be investigators or the public at large. But here, like, and I know hindsight's 20/20 and all, but like, did no one put that together? Mikhail Popkov killed 81 women, and yes, you heard me right, 81, from 1992 to 2010. Not much is known about his life growing up, although, you know, the intense hatred of women probably had some developmental standing. But early on, Mikhail became a police officer before taking a semi-retirement job as a security guard at a chemical facility. What motivated his initial killings, according to him, was he believed his wife was cheating on him whenever he found 2 wrappers in the trash can of his home. She was also in law enforcement, and it turned out later that she was with a previous one of his colleagues. And this angered him enough that he decided to just take his hatred out on seemingly women at random. The reason that he was able to perform killings for that long and that many people without getting caught is because the range of his killings was over 2,000 miles. What he would do is he would use the cop car that he still had, as well as don his policeman's uniform, and then drive through towns looking for girls he believed to be intoxicated, to which he would then offer them a ride home, and once they got in his vehicle, he would restrain them before taking them somewhere desolate. very heavily beating and torturing them before murdering them. As mentioned, a lot of these killings were rage motivated, so he would absolutely devastate the bodies to the point that several of them were totally unrecognizable as people. It was for the ferocity of these murders that he was given the name the Werewolf, which again is way too cool, but I'm just gonna keep going. Also, and information on him is kind of like sparse for some reason, like people don't really dig into the details as much as I'd like, but I saw several mentions that among the murder weapons he would use like things stolen from police evidence lockups, which on the surface level you're like, oh, that means nothing could be traced back to him or whatever, but like, wouldn't using things that had to be taken from a police station pretty much like draw the confirmation that it was a police officer? I have to be missing something there, but like if at whatever police station he is able to walk into and take an axe from, and then they find an axe at a crime scene, they're like, huh, that's weird. During this entire thing, Mikhail was living a perfectly normal life, to the point that he was revered as a respected member of the community, and his children and wife thought of him as a very loving husband. To give you an idea of how non-suspicious this guy was, one of the victims that, from everything I could tell, was totally random was his daughter's elementary school teacher. So because of the tragedy of this teacher murdered at the height of her life, the school began a charity donation in order to help the family with funeral costs, to which Mikhail was one of the highest contributing donors and gave some words of grace to the family and like seemingly helped them with the burial and everything. And one of the girls that he attempted to murder actually survived and positively identified him. What had happened is he killed her by beating her head against a tree. Like I said, the guy was very brutal. But although he thought it killed her, it actually just knocked her out, and whenever she got up and went to the police, she was able to ID him. However, his wife, thinking this to be some absurd misunderstanding, gave him a false alibi that she was with him on the night of the attempted murder, and the police, believing him to be such a great guy, pretty much just shut up the girl's testimony and went on from there. What eventually got Russian investigators to get a hold of him was at the crime scenes they began to put together that the tire tracks on the ground were a specific match to police vehicles at the time. Again, don't know how the weapons from evidence lockers didn't also trip that same thing, but whatever. And after doing a DNA test to almost every cop in Russia, they managed to find a link between his DNA and the one that he would leave at crime scenes. He was eventually charged with 22 murders, but then later, after they did all the math, it came out to 83, which makes him Russia's most prolific serial killer. And Mikhail is still alive in jail in Russia to this day. William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer, killed at least 21 boys from 1979 to 1980. And I talk about like a lot of messed up guys in the series, and I have so far, and they all are. But William Bonin's particularly evil for reasons I'm going to talk about, and this is going to be, I don't know how to like talk about the details of this without being really gross, so again, the whole viewer discretion thing. Anyway, at a young age, Bonin had an abusive father who would regularly beat him, and also would normally give him to his grandfather, who was a known child predator. And after several years of that cycle of abuse, Bonin's mother put him and his two brothers into an orphanage so that they would be away from his father and grandfather's care. However, that turned out to not be any better, as the orphanage itself was also super abusive and would normally do things like dunking kids' heads underwater and nearly drowning them, or forcing them to get into fistfights with each other, and yada yada. It was also common for him to be assaulted in various ways by boys older than himself, to which, and this matters later, he would allow them to do it if they first tied his hands up, because then he enjoyed it. And then after his mother got away from his abusive father, she took him back at the age of 9 years old. Yes, all of this happened before the kid was 9. And at the age of 10, he got arrested and sent to juvie for stealing license plates to which, you guessed it, in juvie, he was rapidly abused again. In all of these killings, especially the more evil ones that we see, there is a very clear connection between abuse at childhood equaling them becoming an abuser later in life. And whenever I talk about this stuff, I don't want it to seem like an excuse or an excusal method at all, because with this case, as well as the others, at some point the victim becomes the attacker. And especially with cases like I'm about to describe, I don't want it to come off as a means of reason for these crimes, but more so a means of causation, if that makes sense. So basically, I'm not bringing up these points in order to soften the blow of how horrible these people were, but more so as a means of evil begatting evil. And as we can see in this case, much of the time, the apple that falls from the tree is much, much worse than the tree that it fell from. Around the end of his adolescence, his mother essentially forced him into a marriage with a woman because his mom believed him to be homosexual. However, there's a big difference between homosexual and the things he was actually doing. Like, he would regularly offer young children beer and then get them drunk so that he could have his way. And around the time he turned 18, he joined the military to fight in Vietnam. He fought as an aerial gunner and even earned an award for saving the life of a fellow airman. However, it was during this time in Vietnam that he began to develop the idea that life itself is pretty overrated. And while over there, he assaulted 2 other fellow military airmen by holding them at gunpoint and making himself have his way with them. After getting out of the military, he developed a habit of kidnapping young boys, tying them up, doing deeds before releasing them and then dumping them somewhere on the road, although he wasn't killing them yet. In 1969, he was arrested for doing this on 5 separate occasions and got convicted, and here comes the part where I get mad about the legal system. Because of his history and the fact that people who talked to him saw that something was very clearly off in his demeanor, instead of prison, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. He was in the psychiatric hospital for about 2 years before they sent him to prison because he wouldn't stop assaulting the other male inmates. So since he never was sentenced to prison, he was instead sentenced to a psychiatric hospital until he quote unquote rehabilitated or whatever. And then the hospital couldn't handle him, so they send him to prison. He technically doesn't have a sentence. It's still just till he's rehabilitated. And after only 1 year, the police decided that, well, I guess he's good to go, and just let him out. To which about 3 months after getting out of prison, he did the exact same thing again to another young boy. And after another young boy, 3 days after that attack, resisted his advances, he tried to hit him with his own car. So someone who has a very vast history of sexual violence and then was convicted of doing horrific acts to 5 different young boys before being sent to a hospital that he got kicked out of because he couldn't stop there, got out of jail after 1 year, and then 3 months after that did the same thing again. Just take a guess how long he got sentenced to. He got sentenced to just under 3 years. And shortly after that is when the killing started. He started attending house parties where he met guys who thought that his interests were cool, and he also started picking up his whole activity of getting kids drunk so that he could, but that wasn't enough for him. So with the help of his new accomplices that he would variously rotate through, he started his killing spree. What would happen is him and one of his accomplices would drive around in a van and just look for boys between the ages of 10 and 17 who were out on their own, either at bus stations or walking home from school or hanging out at the beach or whatever. As soon as they were in the van, his accomplice would begin driving as Bonin would tie up the kids and then beat and abuse them in various ways before murdering them, most often through strangulation with their own t-shirt, and then dumping their bodies on the side of the freeway, which gave him the name of the Freeway Killer. And also, I have to mention this because I hate the courts. During the middle of this murder spree, he was arrested on, unrelated to these murders, a charge of him just molesting a young boy. And I say just, but you get what I mean at this point. To which he got out on a clerical error. Like, someone didn't file the paperwork right or whatever, so they're like, oh, you're free to go. So the dude was in custody and could have been jailed and the whole killing spree stopped. But what is it, like the 6th time now that the court's messed up in some way, he got loose? Anyway, and I don't go into too much of the specific gory details with a lot of these killers I talk about, mostly out of respect to the victims involved, but also because, especially in the true crime community, there seems to be a lot of gratuitousness or interest taken in the viciousness of the actions. Like, for example, I'll give you the facts of how people were killed or the manner that the killer would do it, but I don't like to dwell on the horrors that these people went through, just because it most often comes down to, in my opinion, focusing on the wrong things and glorifying the heinous nature of these actions. But what I can tell you is that reading through the files and like Bonin's killings in particular, there was something especially evil about them. Like, without exaggeration, Bonin loved absolutely every second of it, from planning it out to finding a victim to the act itself. And then he would recollect later on about how obsessed he was with the incredibly gruesome specifics of each case. Like, for example, one of the boys who was murdered had $10 in his pocket. And after they had ditched his body, him and the accomplice he was with drove through a McDonald's and used the $10 in order to get burgers. And then while chewing on the burger, laughed and said, "Thanks, kid." Which is just like a whole new level of like depravity and hellishness. One boy was even picked up and let go at one point because Bonin said that there were too many people that saw the boy get into his car. However, that didn't stop Bonin from explaining to the boy exactly what he would have done to him if there weren't any witnesses before dropping him off. And he also did things like collect newspaper clippings talking about the freeway killings and would regularly relate to his friends how much he just loved doing it. Whenever all this came to light, one of the accomplices said that at one point they had just gone through the whole act, murdered a boy, to which Bonin sat there for a minute after they dumped the body and said, "I'm bored, let's get another one." And then they killed a second one in the same day. So that boy I mentioned a minute ago who was picked up and then let go, that kid eventually got thrown into jail for some minor crime. And upon hearing people talk about the freeway killers, he told a police officer at the jail that it sounds a whole lot like a guy who picked him up at one point. So based on this boy's testimony, they began a surveillance measure on Bonin himself. To which, after following his van around and then eventually seeing a young boy get into his car, the police converged on the vehicle, to which they found him in the back. Yeah, and Bonin was finally caught and went to trial. All of the accomplices agreed to testify against him in exchange for not receiving the death penalty, except for one accomplice who hung himself upon being caught. During the testimony time of the trial, it was regular for the press as well as family members to leave the room and in some cases begin crying and throwing up outside of the courtroom, because the depraved nature of Bonin's actions was just that, very depraved. And during the testimony, several things came forward, like the fact that Bonin just loved the sounds of kids dying and found there was no point in living outside of committing murder. Also, like, there were several points within the court trial. Like, okay, so there's several different murders that he was eventually convicted of, or it figured out that he did. However, there were these weird gambit plays that were played within the courtroom. Like, for example, whenever the police initially came and they're like, "Did you murder that kid?" He'd be like, "No, but if you don't charge me for it, I can show you where the body is." And like, I know it doesn't matter that much because they still convicted him on like 10 murders, but just the fact that the way courts work is, oh, well, he showed us where this body is, which means he absolutely did it, but because we shook hands, we gotta, you know, not try him for that one, which again, I know doesn't matter because he was convicted on other ones, but just like, courts are so dumb because potentially due to these very stupid arbitrary rules, and as we saw many times earlier within this very case, people can just get off because of these dumb things that everyone agrees to follow. So we have to let evil people go because, oh, that's what the secret pinky promise says to do. Finally, after all of the misadventures and ways that Bonin managed to be let go time and time again, he was given the death penalty. That didn't stop him from being on death row for 14 years, to which he picked up hobbies like painting and other things he shouldn't be allowed to do, and even had these times where he was playing bridge with other famous serial killers from the region at the time. And somehow, he began writing letters to the mothers of the children that he had killed, which for one, who let him do that? But in the letters, there was zero remorse as well. As a matter of fact, to one mother, he said, "Your son was my favorite. He was the best screamer I ever had." I don't know how, we all agreed that someone can do things like that and show zero remorse, and we're like, well, another 11 years of death row for you. Finally in 1996, he was killed by lethal injection, which was the first lethal injection in the state of California. He was described in court as the most arch-evil person who ever existed. And while I can't, validate that because there's been so many evil people throughout history, he's at least top 100. Probably. Well, that was painful to get through. Let's get to one with a funny name, even though the killings weren't funny at all, but the Doodler. The Doodler is known to be responsible for 5 murders, although some believe the number could be as high as 16, from 1974 to 1975. Now, the Doodler has never been identified, but the reason he was given this name was for the nature of his killings. Essentially, the Doodler would go to various gay nightclubs and then entice men by drawing sketches of them. So in other words, he would watch someone from across the bar, draw a picture of them, walk up to them, and then use that as a flirtation. After this, he would then take them into the beach before stabbing them to death, and then leaving that sketched image on the body as a sort of calling card. That's the reason that there's 5 confirmed by him and 16 suspected, because 5 people were found with the sketch on them, and then the other 11 were people that were just murdered in a similar nature near the area, although the sketch was never found. So either those weren't the killing of the Doodler, or he simply just stopped doing it. The reason that all of this came to light is because there were 3 men who survived their attack. All 3 of them gave the exact same story, that a man walked up to them at a nightclub, that he handed them a sketch of themselves, took them to the beach before trying to murder them. That's where sketches like this come from, as well as the explained means of how the murders went down. So off of the testimony of these 3 men, they eventually found someone who the police believe to be the Doodler. This person's identity has never been made public because the 3 attacked men would not come forward and testify because they didn't want to out themselves as being homosexual. And these 3 men themselves have never been publicly identified, although the police said that one of them, a leak came through, was a nationally known entertainer, so potentially a large movie star who didn't want to come out as homosexual. And then from here, the stories get weird. Apparently a psychiatrist came forward saying that one of his clients had confessed to him to be the Doodler killer, and the police have apparently interviewed this killer several times around the time that the murder took place, but he was never able to be charged because, like I mentioned, no one was willing to come forward. And in 2019, the police said that the Doodler is still alive and still their primary suspect for the case. But as mentioned, there's not much that they can do about it now if no one's willing to say anything. And while it seems good that the Doodler hasn't struck again since the initial spree that occurred in the span of 2 years, that doesn't mean justice shouldn't be done for the families of those murdereds. So hopefully either it's this person that the police believe it to be, or whoever it is has or will face justice in some way, but there's nothing really for anyone to do except, I guess, be mad about it. And that will do it for tier 6 of the serial killer Iceberg. That one was a depressing one. So the reason that I said at the beginning that I think because there's 2 tiers left, there's tier 7 and tier 8. The reason I think I can do both of those in one video, even though it's the same number of entries, is because from just looking at it, several of them are unsolved cases. So like the Doodler, I can't spend a ton of time talking about, like, the killer's life or what they did or the trial or whatever, because there never has been one. So I believe the research and information should be shorter. Knock on wood, I say should be. But either way, we're getting close to the end. So this was, again, tier 6. This is, especially Bonin. The most depraved ones I've looked at yet. I am sad now, and will continue to be sad about it. I'm just giving you all a hard time. This is obviously very evil circumstances, but I know there's an interest in it, and as with any of my videos, you know, I try to maintain it as educational. So I was hope that this was educational to you, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as one can enjoy this kind of topic. And I hope I didn't make it too depressing. But either way, thank you for watching, and thank you for sticking to this long in the video. I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you so much for sticking with me. What are we at now? Like 558,000. It's not even a real number. This is all a fever dream I'm going to wake up from eventually. But thank you guys for sponsoring it. But thank you for that. Speaking of sponsors, thank you so much to my patrons here. At the time this video goes up, the patrons will know that there have been some changes to the Patreon. Just working out some things. Thank you all so much for the support that you guys have given me, and especially to my top tier supporters here. But just as time has gone on, there's needed to be some adjustment with the Patreon and everything. So hopefully that's all going well. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for being supportive. I love you all the most. It means a lot. This was a very depressing topic, I know, but thank you for sticking with me this long, and thank you all for sticking with me as long as you have. So upcoming videos, I've got some one-offs I want to do. After this serial killer iceberg's over, I'm really excited to get back into the one-off icebergs, like the Bible iceberg, like the cult iceberg, you know, just one episode and you're done, because the research isn't as intensive. But I also enjoy doing this. But just thank you all for watching it either way. Thank you that I can do weird content like the political compass video or whatever, and you all remain supportive. It's very cool, and it means a lot to me. So thank you all so much for sticking with me through it. I hope that you enjoyed, if you are still watching, and I hope that you liked it. If not, I'm sorry. But I hope that I will see you in the next one. And have a good day, and love you all, and bye!